Thank you, John. Thank you, Adrian, for the invitation. And it's a pleasure to be here today. Thanks also to the student organizers, Rachel and Evelyn and the rest. You've been super helpful today. In Jakarta, Indonesia, one of the most vulnerable cities to climate change, massive floods in January of 2013 yet again called attention to the city's failing infrastructure and the plight of residents, particularly the urban poor living in the informal kampong settlements along the coastline and 13 rivers. Jakarta's predicament garnered attention and action. Then Governor Jokowi, newly elected and popular, promised change, enlisting South Korean conglomerates to re-envision the notorious Ciliwung River. Scientists from the Singapore ETH sent drones down the river to capture point cloud data for three-dimensional hydrological models, and world-renowned architects joined efforts to design ambitious vertical kampongs. Then, on a visit to Jakarta, Melanie Schultz, the Dutch Minister for Infrastructure and Environment, announced a master plan for a giant seawall, itself a new city for 1.5 million people to be built right in the Jakarta Bay. And from the air, it resembles a giant Garuda, the mythical bird that is Indonesia's national symbol. The proposal promises to solve flooding problems, ease congestion, function as a freshwater reservoir, and provide a new central business district. The giant seawall places renewed urgency on projects by the World Bank and Japanese Development Agency, JICA, to dredge and widen rivers and canals, and these projects directly threaten the displacement of poor urban residents along the canals and rivers. Some community groups in the kampongs have attempted to resist efforts to relocate them, organizing and proposing alternatives to business as usual eviction and displacement. So as the debates over cities and climate change intensify, governments are coming up with increasingly ambitious plans to respond to climate impacts. And these plans involve extensive reconfigurations of built and natural environments and massive economic resources. They promise ecological security and the perpetuation of economic growth. Yet they often raise intractable social questions, including decisions about how and what to protect on sites that are already home to marginalized urban residents. Academic research and practice in the fields of architecture, planning, public policy, and engineering each address and engage parts of this problem, but divisions in how we see and do things blind us to the interconnected processes that link environment, space, and sociopolitical contestation. I argue for a new kind of sociospatial analysis in order to understand the ways in which environmental projects are intertwined within dominant modes of global capitalist urban development, and the ways in which alternative visions to these dominant modes are formed and might be harnessed towards more equitable, transformative urban futures. So my talk today is centered on Jakarta, but is part of a larger study on the urban spatial politics of climate change adaptation. I look at sites and strategies in 3 cities, investigating the dominant plans, usually large-scale, state-led, top-down, and as well searching out the alternate narratives, what I call the counterplans. So we see in the dominant plans within each urban region, the interconnections on both national and municipal levels, and the contestation, alternate ideas about the future of the city. And these initiatives represent contested visions in response to social and environmental challenges with different, often oppositional methods, objectives, and priorities. They bring to mind institutional power relationships, the histories and geographies of marginalization, systemic oppressions of race and class, and the political economy of place, urban spatial politics in a new context of global environmental change. In my research more broadly, I inquire into the ways in which these contested visions are produced and attain power, particularly in the face of climate change and uneven social and spatial urban development. And I'll bring up a couple of these aspects today. This research takes place in the context of two interrelated conditions. First, the impacts of climate change present a number of critical risks to urban centers, threatening health and safety, livelihoods, and systems and services. Cities are attempting to adapt to these impacts, and so-called world cities and economic ecological coalitions position themselves as obvious actors and places to respond to climate change threats. This often results in infrastructural unevenness and the making of exclusionary premium ecological enclaves. Processes of urban policymaking are accelerating and crossing scales and levels, what researchers call fast policy regimes and the interreferencing of urban models. Second, we are at a particularly critical point in our understanding of the urban. The destabilizing of the very concept, first posed and debated in the 1970s by Castells and Lefebvre, to now, or recently, the assertion in the last decade of the so-called global urban age, and now planetary urbanization, where increasingly potent urban processes are radically transforming not just the urban agglomerations, but the so-called hinterlands, agricultural regions and zones of extreme climates and ecosystems. So scholarship on adaptation, mostly in fields of planning, policy, and geography, has tended to reinforce divisions between social and spatial, assumed urban politics to be contained and cohesive, and relied on static conceptualizations of the city as a bounded territory. It has neglected, mostly, the multifaceted role of design. And this question of design especially begs for exploration and precision. For those of us who study urban design, our core theoretical lineages now show their limitations, faced with a set of intertwined challenges. Climate change, for sure, and as well the pervasiveness of globalization, increasingly connected grassroots social movements, and the preponderance of mega projects changing the urban world. The bigness of our problems appears to demand a reconsideration of big utopian visions. I ground my research in theories that explain social and spatial power relationships in the urban and the interrelationships between social, ecological, and technological processes in and through cities. I develop a method of urban relational analysis to study disparate yet highly interconnected sites, taking cues from precedents for a more reflexive approach to case selection and analysis, and those that call for a relational reading of sites, each understood through the others. So I'll make two claims from this research today on the ways in which urban environmental projects are globally networked and on the ways in which representations of urban futures are political. So first, in exploring these new geographies of concept mobilities, I find that the coupling of environmental urgencies and shifting economic forces opens avenues of exchange, bridging geographic scales and political boundaries. The giant seawall in Jakarta, the master plan is paid for by the Dutch government. Its primary authors are all Dutch engineering firms, urban designers and landscape architects, and economic development consultants. And I trace these actors and institutions from Jakarta back to the Netherlands, where economic restructuring and climate change have prompted a shift in Dutch planning beyond national projects such as the Delta Works towards, on the one hand, local urban scale interventions, like on the left, the Room for the River program, and on the right, water squares in Rotterdam, and on the other hand, the development of international relationships between Dutch agencies and firms and cities and countries around the world. So in Jakarta, the deep involvement of the Dutch brings up provocative questions. Minister Schultz, on unveiling the plan, said, quote, "We Dutch feel very much at home here. We feel senang, at ease." So this, in Jakarta, a city that very much exhibits the social, spatial, and technological legacy of more than 300 years of Dutch colonialism. So this is certainly one version of climate-induced disaster capitalism. And even beyond that, it's tempting to see this as an example of environmental neocolonialism in the context of what Ananya Roy and others have called neoliberal market-driven empire. So take first a static view of the relationship between nation states and cities. What we find then is a multi-scalar, multi-level network through which capital, knowledge, and influence flows. These networks are empowered by colonial and post-colonial histories, the inherited conventions of global development, and now the imperatives of climate change. So what's notable here is the ways in which national strategy, national imperatives are operationalized through cities. And urban networks such as Connecting Delta Cities and entities such as Deltares, the Dutch Research Institute, are part of new relationships that start to pull the global and the urban together, the top to the bottom and back. Second, in examining the ways through which ideas and visions attain power, I find that design is multivalent. It is simultaneously process, practice, and outcome, and it is often invoked towards specific political ends. So for the big plans, design negotiates between the structure of the organization and the sociopolitics of its context. And the Jakarta Giant Seawall, while certainly technically ambitious, dealing with floods both from the sea and from the rivers, and actually, as an aside, this is often framed as a sea level rise plan. It is actually mostly a sinking city plan, and we can get into that later if you want. But Dutch consultants highlighted symbol and culture through design. And according to a Dutch hydrologist, this Garuda eagle-shaped design changed, quote, a Dutch development aid project into a national ambition. So design here works to connect the pragmatic to the emotional. On the other hand, for Kampong activists in Jakarta, design is a platform for organizing. It makes political vision tangible. Says a local activist, quote, we proved that a collective planning process could be made by the community themselves in ways that were concrete. So for them, design connects the emotional to the pragmatic. Importantly, the counterplans, these activist organizations, are themselves networked across geographic scales. So in Jakarta, the network of organizers, activists, and researchers links the immediate site through larger regional scales and as well to more abstract levels of urban governance. So this kind of counter-network presents a way of thinking of new reflexive modes of resistance. So in this new landscape of climate policy mobilities, urban adaptation projects, while globally constituted, are embedded within and reflect existing urban sociospatial systems. Climate change exposes and enhances motivations and contradictions in existing global relationships. It also facilitates new avenues for capital exchange and accumulation. The production of alternative visions of the future opens terrains of contestation, enabling modes of organizing and resistance to hegemonic systems. Accordingly, I think that urban research needs to move forwards dramatically in a number of key areas. First, to build on relational reflexive research methods that enable nimble, extensive, and deep engagements with phenomena that are simultaneously local and global. Second, to develop more effective analytical concepts and categories to bridge the spatial, physical aspects and the socio-political processes of built and natural environments. And third, to engage the processes and practice of design as a research object with radically new approaches from within the methods and knowledge claims of our various disciplines. So to end, I'll elaborate on a couple of these issues. An important proposition in my work is that urban adaptation is simultaneously social and spatial, and I developed a set of typologies for adaptation that focuses on the level of cohesion of both social organization and spatial form of the strategies. And one of the risks of this research is overplaying the dichotomy between top-down and bottom-up, global and local. And in fact, we've seen that the proponents of the dominant plans have to some extent advocated for participation, and the counterplans are themselves multi-scalar and networked. And so a new way to organize these forms of adaptation allows us to learn from both dominant plans and counterplans in relationship to their contexts, the social relations and spatial realities on the ground. So finally, a condition of urbanization on a planetary scale does not imply an urban design of planetary dimensions, but design could be premised on the relationship between processes of urbanization and planetary scale impacts. Taking cues from Manuel Castell's Space of Autonomy, can designers of the urban search out and create a hybrid space between the sites of logical intervention and the sites of conceptualization and organization, all while situated in what James Holston calls, quote, the ethnography of the present? To do so, we need to take more seriously political education, including theories of social change, learning how to learn from diverse global sites. And we need to create new forms of collaborative network practices that are globally informed but situated in the local. So to illustrate, a critical project of urban ecological design in recent years has been to assert the centrality of urban ecologies in the understanding and ordering of urban form. Researchers and practitioners have unearthed and exploited the complex interplay of built and natural, and contested the false dichotomies of city and nature. They've shown us that the operations of urban ecologies transcend traditional planning and political boundaries. So now the critical project, I think, would be to extend these frameworks and to give form to the relationships between urban ecologies and two sets of interconnected processes, two sets of interconnected forces, that of global urban development and grassroots movements for social change. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this chance to be part of such a fascinating conference. Adrian and John asked me to talk about a book that I just co-authored with Eric Carver called The Underdome Guide to Energy Reform. And I actually presented a very earlier phase of the research for that book here at the Fourth Natures Conference, I guess several years ago. And it's a special pleasure for me to be able to bring the project back and show you how it's developed. Just to give you a bit of background, Underdome is a guidebook for architects about the politics of energy. The project started with a hunch that environmental technologies always contain a kind of hidden politics. So we wanted to examine green design's technocratic assumptions, things like LEED standards or green sourcing mantras, and really question design solutions that often go unchallenged, things like self-sustaining cities or locavore farms or new urbanist densification, for example. So to do this, we mapped a new taxonomy of sometimes contending, sometimes affiliated positions on energy. And then we drew each agenda as a dome icon, positioned on a grid around 4 topics: power, territory, lifestyle, and risk. So for example, power asks who rules and is ruled by energy, ranging from governments, corporations, and organizations to individuals. And the vertical axis here positions the grassroots against centralized control, and then the horizontal sweeps from markets to regulation. As for the other topics, territory looks at the shape and expanded networks of the contemporary metropolis. Lifestyle describes public norms and behaviors, and risk asks how we collectively respond to uncertainty and the threat, and the threat of climate-related disasters. So for each topic, the book combines essays and transcripts alongside a visual guide. What do I have here? There we go. For each topic, the book combines essays and transcripts alongside a visual guide. And we illustrated the agendas through 48 case studies in order to kind of test out the protocols, territories, symbols and scales of their associated architectural strategies. So today I will present a few case studies through the lens of their drawing techniques to test what it might mean to represent ambience in the context of energy politics. So let's just start with axonometrics. The style of these drawings, and this is an overview of all of our case study drawings, in part tries to evoke the kind of dry presentation style of books like Architectural Graphic Standards or patent drawings. And yet, while those drawings evoke an aura of precision to describe technical performance and material assembly, our drawings also aim to unpack rhetorical associations as well, ones that emerge through their technical language. The recurring theme that unpacks these agendas is the dome. We created the term underdome to reference the idea that domes are both devices of environmental conditioning and stages for debate. So they're like biodome, and like thunderdome. So what does underdome mean for us? I think although people typically see domes as self-contained bubbles or expressions of closed-loop systems, we wanted to explore a more expansive definition of these devices by recognizing the role of any energy enclave within much larger networks and influences. So to emphasize this, we used transparency in our drawings to imagine the dome as a kind of gel cap, so you can kind of see what's going on both inside and outside. So I'll start with these two projects, which of course don't really look like domes, but they do act like them in many ways. To unpack them a little bit further, and this is what I mean by an agenda, when faced with the threat of a warming planet, we could provide and leverage government power to implement construction projects, or we could smash the state and clear new ground for political autonomy. Because these would be sort of two positions pit against each other. So in the first case, the Federal Weatherization Assistance Project uses funds from the Department of Energy to support maintenance and building upgrades for low-income residents. Whereas most energy programs typically work only for homeowners, WAP works with tenants as well, and at sites ranging from rural homes to public housing towers. So on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, this proposed Citadel separatist compound in Idaho empowers its citizens with control of their own means of survival. Each home would be supplied with a 2,500-gallon water tank, 1 year's supply of food, 1 or 2 AR-15 variant rifles with 1,000 rounds of ammunition each, a generator, composting toilet, a vault, and a protective safe room. So in theory, residents could live without fear of natural disaster or grid failure, or maybe most importantly in their eyes, taxation. These two projects kind of look the same at first glance. They both have generic pitched roofs and green lawns. They both buffer conditioned interiors from the world outside, whether in the first case by kind of re-skinning the building layer by layer, or in the second case by protecting their valuables behind bunker walls. But of course, we can also discern major differences here. And while the Citadel tries to make political and social autonomy coincident with its own isolated infrastructure, WAP peels away layers of responsibility and risk and then reassigns a share directly back to the state. I think what makes the Citadel puzzling is not just that it manifests some kind of like a Sarah Palin urbanism, but that it uses the same rhetoric as green design. So its ideologies of self-sufficiency and resource independence can't really be so easily dismissed. And its rhetoric is strangely echoed in the operations of buildings like this, the Bank of America Tower in Manhattan, whose cogeneration plant required architects Cook and Fox to acquire permits for a dedicated natural gas pipeline in the middle of Midtown Manhattan. And while the B of A exemplifies a kind of corporate-led reform, The recent renovation of a very different New York City icon, I think starts to demonstrate how local governments have succeeded in regulating landlords. So in 2009, the city's Greener Greater Buildings Plan policy incentivized tenant sub-metering in some of the city's largest buildings. So individualized environmental controls on a tenant level have thus created a kind of new patchwork of microclimates. So together, I think projects like these reveal how fluctuating arrangements of public and private investment can start to construct new forms of civic enclosure, and with them, new publics. So let's move on to the question of color. As you can see, all of the drawings are done in two colors, red and blue, in part to convey temperature. So unlike the kind of pointillized, like micro zones of the Empire State Building, island enclaves such as Foster's Masdar complex in Abu Dhabi, Institute in Abu Dhabi, unifies its inhabitants in a kind of bubble of air conditioning. And this is a kind of privilege that's interestingly reversed by this project, which turns discomfort into a new kind of delight. So here, the architects Bittertang imagine a pleasure ground created by a layer of inflated balloons that would intensify summer heat below and kind of create this like mushroom growing landscape. Red and blue, of course, also signify the two American political parties and remind us of this very symbolic nature of energy programming. So from the White House vegetable garden to this Norwegian garbage incineration plant, which amazingly accepts garbage from the US because Norway just doesn't have enough. The image of sustainability can be alternately advertised or repressed. So this leads me to the question of visibility, and I guess this question of boundary. So we drew each case study as a kind of section cut removed from the earth, in part to suggest that long distance and long-term effects are really only sometimes visible beneath and above the envelope of a dome. So this technology would presume otherwise. This gel literally peels radioactive waste away from contaminated sites. But of course, as we know, the blowback of risk often emerges unexpectedly. So now abandoned plans for a nuclear waste repository at Yucca Mountain, for example, would of course have had to grapple with a nearby fault line, which you can see down here, and a water table much closer than previously imagined. Or this attempt to geoengineer climate change by dumping iron sulfate into the ocean off the coast of British Columbia would alter the food chain in, of course, very unpredictable ways. So the bases or the podiums in our drawings really also try to question where the boundaries of energy territories can be drawn. Thanks to the National Flood Insurance Program, for example, homeowners in low-lying areas such as the Everglades, which you see on the right, effectively receive flood insurance subsidies from homeowners in places like the Rocky Mountain on the left, even though they pay market rates for fire insurance. Or in a somewhat inverse approach, Brad Pitt's Make It Right Foundation leveraged celebrity clout to build homes in post-Katrina New Orleans. In this case, though, in our drawing, we thought it was necessary to just zoom out and show the reliance of these kind of boutique structures, which you see clustered on the in red on the left, on much larger flood control infrastructures created by the Army Corps of Engineers. Somewhat surprisingly, in a similar way, Bjarke Ingels' design for the West 57th Tower in Manhattan similarly boasts sustainability features only because it shares its systems with the LEED Platinum building next door, called the Helena, and low-income housing requirements with another neighbor, the Frank, which is just on the back of the block, all collectively owned by the Durst Corporation. So today we've looked at examples that range from public housing retrofits to separatist compounds, from private enclaves to new pleasure grounds, and from offshore economies to tethered landscapes. And we can see that each project makes claims to efficiency and sustainability, But we also witness here a kind of vast panorama of answers to the question, who shall govern the land and on whose behalf? And of course, architects are active participants here. We design architectural envelopes, enclaves, and standards, and in doing so help to reconstruct relationships between resources and publics. And while it might be tempting to frame the energy debate around efficiency equations, we also hope that people will consider questions of inclusion and exclusion embedded within these approaches. So in one last example, I thought I'd just point to the way that text and icon and drawings have worked side by side in the book. And I think this brings us back to this question of the relationship between rhetoric and the technical drawing. So to illustrate the position called share communal living, we drew the positions icon, which you can see pretty small on the upper left-hand side, as an image of Drop City to suggest the social utopias imagined by hippie communes in the 60s. Somewhat perversely, though, we decided to illustrate this in a case study with the Louisiana State Penitentiary in Angola to reflect on, I think, the kind of fine line between self-reliance and the kind of charismatic-led communities or kind of centralized command-led communities that I think a lot of the 60s communes were also criticized as being. Though the Angola prison touts itself, and very vocally does so, touts itself as a self-sustaining agricultural community, we also, of course, wanted to point out in our text that its inmates work for 4 to 20 cents an hour and perpetuate the site's very bitter legacy as a cotton and sugarcane plantation. Now that the book has been out for a couple of months, we've been excited to see a number of reviews come out, some super supportive, some super skeptical. And I think that it was interesting to me that some of the critics, I think, felt a little frustrated that the book wasn't more didactic, you know? I think one author misread our intended sarcasm and criticized us for being sympathetic to the Louisiana State Penitentiary. And then the other day, a friend of mine called the drawings dry, and I kind of felt torn, like I didn't know if I agreed with that or not. And I think ultimately, Eric Carver and I, have really always thought of the book as deadpan, above all. And we've attempted to present ourselves as kind of neutral, in part to let the strangeness and contradictions of each project emerge. So this is where I think I wanted to return to the title of this talk. You know, in reference to this question of a guidebook, right? We like to say that this is a guidebook that offers no guidance. So in other words, kind of like a voter guide, it outlines competing agendas without making a direct recommendation. We hope that this kind of apparent neutrality ultimately will help us avoid a kind of prepackaged idea of sustainability, and help to imagine, I think, a much more politically and architecturally ambitious response. So we believe that we had to take all of these agendas seriously, even ones that we might find reprehensible, really to see what their implicit tactics and messages are and seek out ways to reassign their meanings. So at the same time, we are stacking the deck. You know, by enumerating these choices, we are defining a field of possibilities. And ultimately then, our hope is that, you know, that designers who read our book will take a stand on these issues while recognizing contradictions and opposing perspectives to each approach. So for the sake of today's conversation, I created a new matrix that outlines a spectrum from neutral to directive, from sarcastic to earnest. Maybe you can help me locate this project and others on this spectrum. And I think in it that the term ambience, so if the term ambience describes both a kind of physical and a social milieu for the design disciplines, then perhaps ambience in Underdome, at least, points not only to the way we draw energies, networks, and collectives, but also to the way that one constructs public debates around these contentious topics. Thank you very much.
I'm grateful to have the opportunity to come back to the school where I completed this work and talk about it within a a different context and talk about the drawings, which I use to really rethink my position and complete the work. So I've called this Drawing the Post-Human Alternate Perceptions of the Urban Environment. The ever-expanding metropolitan regions of North America and the world, as we've heard already today, are part of a complex global ecosystem. The Greater Toronto Area, the boroughs of New York, even the Waterloo region are urban biomes which are teeming with diversity of animal species that often exist at the periphery of the human consciousness. It's not until we're confronted with the raccoon living in our chimney, the squirrels who have gotten into our walls, or the family of ducks crossing the street that we begin to acknowledge the non-human species who cohabitate alongside us. Who are they, is the question. How do they perceive our shared environment, and why have they successfully adapted where other animals have failed? So my thesis, entitled Synanthropic Suburbia, which I completed here, investigated these questions. Today I will be sharing how some of my research and representation experiments revealed for me alternate understandings of the ecosystem of the city. The design explorations which followed these drawings attempted to leverage a post-human perception to inform the design of an ecologically inclusive domestic architecture and suburban strategy. Early in my research, I encountered this term synanthropic, which was new for me, and it describes plants and animal species that benefit from living in close proximity to humans. They're neither domestic nor wild and exist in a kind of in-between space and are often the ones that occupy urban environments alongside of us. So they're the ducks and the raccoons and the squirrels in our attics. So a prime example of a synanthrope is the brown rat, who has colonized the world alongside humans. Historically, their proximity to humans in urban spaces has led to the contamination of food and the spread of Black Plague. 40 years ago, Alberta waged an all-out war against the rat and are probably the only province or territory in North America that are rat-free, partially because of their geography. Alternatively, New York City has kind of accepted the rat as part of the subway system and attempt to moderate their populations with different pest control. But then there's examples of Blek le Rat, which was a graffiti artist in the 1980s who really embodied the rat as a symbol of freedom. He said it was the only free animal in the city. I was interested in how this free animal occupies and moves through physical space of the urban biome. So similar, we were talking about, Jenna was talking about graphic standards. I began to make a graphic standards for rats. How does a rat move? How does it jump? How does it build its home? Because I wanted to understand the spatial qualities of that species. But similar, we've been introduced to the theories of the Umwelt by Jakob von Uexküll. And for me, this was really informative. So for those who weren't here this morning, he developed a theory that organisms perceive space differently, that it's proportional to the complexity of their being. So a bee perceives only the necessary requirements, the flowers which it can receive food from, and not the ones which are not open to it. So it changes how it views the shared environment. Using that, I became interested in how the rat, who has poor vision, sees in dichromatic colors, has a powerful sense of touch and smell, how it perceives our shared environment. And so for me at the time, the shared environment became the house. So really, I was interested. This is just my kitchen here in Cambridge. And so this is what it looks like for me, but for the rat who possibly lives beneath my oven, it would look like this. So furniture would register as light and shadow. Everything would be sort of in these dichromatic blue-green tones, and there would have a totally different perception of the exact same space. Or since they're thigmophilic species, which means they rely upon touch in order to navigate space. Something like a baseboard and the texture of the floor would serve to guide them through towards whatever food source that they could smell. So I then began to think, how does that translate to an urban environment? What is the perception of a rat who lives in a city? So really, I imagined a prototypical city. This is no place and any place at the same time, where I started to think what the sensorial capabilities and physical movement patterns of a rat might enable them to do within the urban environment. So for the rat, the city is really a network of edges, such as subway tracks or basement walls, that is masked in shadows, where heightened smells serve to guide it towards sustenance and safety. Subway tracks, sewer systems, quiet basements really become the playground for these nocturnal creatures. Alternatively, then, I began to think, what about the pigeon, another synanthropic species in the city? And for them, they have very wide monocular vision, and they see space in pentachromatic color, so more colors than we can perceive. And from their aerial position, the built environment registers really as a series of ledges for perching and gathering, concrete surfaces from which to feed upon waste scraps, and mechanical vents and sunny parapets provide warmth during the cold of winter. So neglected buildings even often become places for them to gather, as they're very gregarious species. And then the peregrine falcon, to kind of complete a trifecta of somewhat urban species, they perceive it from obviously a much higher position than pigeons, and for them what becomes very important is heat. So mechanical vents provide great opportunities for them to create nests. Roof ballast is like the exact same as the kind of gravel material that they would have otherwise nested into rock faces. So the city really becomes kind of building cliffs and street valleys for them, as well as the pigeons that were in the previous slide become a prime food source. So I was challenged often in the kind of completion of these drawings as doing my thesis for the fact that they attempt to exemplify animal perspectives, yet are fundamentally architectural drawings in the sense that they're section perspective. I think it raises a question of who are the drawings for. An animal doesn't care to understand its Umwelt, so really the audience is us, it's humans. So for this early experiment, using the common architectural language of a section perspective provided a background basis for me upon which to compare multiple alternate perceptions of the same space, an imagined space in this case. So I think this process of embodying and drawing how others perceive the opportunities and limitations of our shared environment could be leveraged for understanding the perspective of other marginalized individuals. So more recently, I started to think, based on a project that we're working on in the office, what would the Umwelt drawing look like for an elderly person, for someone who's visually, audibly, or physically impaired? How does the built environment register for someone who's homeless, who can't call any one of these buildings theirs, but maybe occupies the park in a different way than we might? What new meaning can be discovered when we inhabit and represent alternative perceptions? So with these studies, I began to conceive of the urban ecosystem as a space of overlap of individual Umwelts. I was most interested in the space of encounter, even collision, between human and synanthrope. Humans have historically defined animals by their relationship to us. So domestic, dependent on humans for survival and augmented to live as companion species, or wild, completely independent, capable of sustaining life without anthropogenic support. However, the synanthrope starts to blur these boundaries between that definition. So I'm interested in how the entangled factors of control and perception influence human-animal interactions. So take these 4 examples. So the bird, when it's in your backyard, viewed from the container of your house, is perceived as entertainment, while if the same bird enters the house uninvited, it suddenly becomes an invader because it's gotten through that boundary of control. Once the bird is contained within a cage within the home, it suddenly becomes a pet who is enjoyable. But the condition I'm most interested in is this synanthropic one, where they find opportunities to occupy the periphery of our homes in ways that maybe we're not always aware of, but that is beneficial for them and doesn't have such negative, potentially, impacts for us. So the question is, how do we as designers of the urban environment begin to engage this non-human subject? And so often in architectural representation, we abstract the human subject into notional figures, which works since we understand the human being, but I think once we get to starting to think about design for animals, to abstract something that we are not and do not understand becomes a very risky thing to do. So within this discourse that's emerging of animal architecture, I think we really need to understand the species and the complexity of it in order to be able to design for and with those animals. So For me, I turned to scientific drawings as a precedence for how to analyze animal species. So Charles Darwin and ornithologist John Gould used drawings to document and communicate the difference between finches found in the Galapagos Islands. Now, with advancements in animal research and photographic technology, we have been able to view animals in a much more intimate manner. So things like camera traps and long focal lenses are allowing us to document animals and their behavior in their natural environment. So I think it's changing how we not only visualize, but understand those species. So I wanted to merge the sort of analytical nature of a scientific drawing with the intimacy and detail of high-resolution photography that tries to capture the fur, the feathers, the teeth, and the claws of those animal species we're trying to engage. And for me, this was a tool for understanding synanthropic species that I wanted to think about in terms of design. So these species parameter drawings, as I've called them, overlay biological relationships, movement patterns, habitat requirements, and human interactions to create representations which try to synthesize the nature of the synanthrope. So the raccoon, which is emblematic for Toronto, has proliferated throughout the city due to mild winters, mature tree canopy, low-density fabric, and an abundance of food available through the green bin system. So the limited predation risks, combined with high accessibility to food, has extended the raccoon's breeding season and has prolonged their lifespan. So the chimney swift has had a very different fate. The cigar-shaped bird can't perch, so it relies upon vertical structures on which it makes twig nests using saliva that it sticks to these walls. So hollow trees and chimneys become prime habitat for them, but since we no longer rely on chimneys within the domestic environment, those have been removed often from houses. So as a result, there's a loss of habitat opportunities for them. So for me, I started to look at how these two very different species could potentially interact. And really, these analytical drawings served as a foundation for design speculation across multiple scales. So instead of a partie diagram, I found myself always turning back to a kind of foundation upon a species drawing. So the projects themselves all sit within the suburban realm because I felt the domestic place, as in the 4 scenarios before, is really the one of most contentious confrontation, where people are most challenged by the presence of animals. So I wanted to augment the suburban home and to think about how that would change our relationship to these species. So this one is an idea for a compost chimney, where you would put compost from the inside of your house into this chimney, and using a gear on the exterior of the chimney, the raccoon would actually be employed, because they can be taught small tasks, would be employed to rotate the composter inside, and as a result, a wage tube would dispense a small morsel of food, and as well as rabies and distemper medication, potentially. So not only are you controlling major issues within the species, you're kind of fostering a certain relationship with them. Meanwhile, the chimney above would provide habitat for the chimney swift, which would also benefit from the heat radiated up from the composting system to extend the shoulder seasons for them. So you can see in section the 3-stage processing of compost and the raccoon who's coming in search of a possible snack. But for me, the idea was really to start with a small-scale implementation and think about how that could start to expand to a suburban scale and have impact on how we plan and think about the neighborhoods that we develop. So this, in theory, proposes a setback corridor. So instead of allowing people to build fences, there's a sort of no man's land territory where everyone is actually allowed to dump their compost. So in other words, your waste would go here. But what it would do would be to nourish the soil that has been so stripped by the engineering process of building new suburbs, that over time it would start to grow and to densify, and people could plant within this region. And your partition between properties would be the screening of trees, but that this would be a corridor that non-human species could navigate quite easily. So that would extend across an entire suburban block. People maybe even build or extend the green corridor between their houses. And then people are also offered an opportunity to reduce their building footprint and increase density in order to give over more of their space, their ground level space, to this expanding corridor. So another species I looked at was the blue swallow. I'm totally bluebird. Thought about them for a long time. I was embarrassed. So the bluebird is one that has been perceived as at risk, and people have built a lot of bluebird nests for them, and people have really advocated for this species. There's been a kind of rallying behind them to make these sort of custom bluebird nests that more popular species like sparrows can't get into. Alternatively, the tree swallow is of a similar type of species and has a similar issues in terms of being outcompeted for habitat. However, people haven't rallied behind this species for whatever reason. There hasn't been the same support, and it's to the degree where sometimes people who will find a tree swallow nest in their custom-made bluebird box will remove that tree swallow nest. So there is a kind of the discussion on the internet and the networks that are created in rallying in support of species, I think, become very narrowly focused when there is the possibility to engage both, that you could have nests for both of these animal species. So this proposal, which is for the downspout, starts to think about how you could pair these two species as long as they live within a kind of certain proximity, that they will cohabitate successfully, but to also rethink somewhat banal components of suburban architecture to say, well, what if these gutters, which are always clogged with debris anyways, start to take on new life of their own, while simultaneously using exhaust from things like dryers and using heat recovery ventilators to then provide warm spaces for species outside the home. As they often try to live in your dryer vents anyways. So this is imagining it at a suburban level, like that it could have, by choosing to put one of these onto your house, you might choose certain vegetation type that you plant that actually supports that species as well. And that you could also imagine them for different types of species requirements, such as the goldfinch, or the bobolink, which is actually a lawn nesting species, that you would actually reposition your house to provide more concentrated green space for them. And that you would also, instead of the green lawn, you maybe start to say, I'm going to let my front lawn grow into a more extensive meadow. So then that could then influence, instead of calling your new neighborhood subdivision kind of notion of the ecosystem that was there before, Oak Ridge or, certain meadows, you could actually then name it after the type of species that you're trying to promote, that it would give you a new way of defining your neighborhood. And so the last pairing of species is the barn owl, who previously was a synanthropic species that lived within barns and actually would hunt rats and mice from farmland. However, since we no longer really use that, we use rodenticide and chemicals instead, this is no longer such a prevalent species. And then the brown bat, which is a much more contentious one because there's a lot more cultural weight to it. However, they do provide productive environmental or ecological services by being voracious consumers of mosquitoes. So by pairing these two and giving them both habitat almost within the boundary of the house, this habitat dormer provides not only additional real estate for humans, adding another room to the house, but provides habitat for the barn owl above and for the bat wall in the cladding of the facade. So this is the kind of appendage that you could add to, and it sort of follows the multi-peaked roofs that are really prevalent within suburban environments anyways. And so you could start to imagine new ecosystems across the suburbs. But for me, the whole project really wanted to start with something as small as the species and a somewhat subtle architectural intervention, and ask how could you multiply that across a vast scale to have greater ecological impact. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Val, for the introduction, and thank you, Adrian and John, for the invitation to be here this afternoon. I have to say the morning was already extremely engaging and stimulating, and the afternoon session is on a similar high level. I have the same anxiety that Derek had when he was standing here, being forced now to summarize this amazing content in 5 minutes. And I had a question, but I think it's going to change once I'm done with my quick summary, the synopsis. So maybe we start once more with the title of the of the session this afternoon, which is dealing with implosion, explosion, and an original metaphor used in the 70s by Henri Lefebvre to describe the concentration of population in the built environment, like the cities that he referred to as the implosions, that goes hand in hand with the projection of the myriad urban fragments across non-urban geographies, which he identified as the explosion. This term was then used by Neil Brenner's recent publication from 2013, Implosion, Explosion Towards the Study of Planetary Urbanization, that Kian already mentioned in her interpretation, in her presentation. So in this new publication, we can't avoid that we are now talking about a very, very different scale. We are talking about a planetary condition. Neil Brenner calls out that we have to completely move away from the city-centric understanding of the contained urban condition and the landscape and the rural and the wild that is still outside there, but that we have to understand the landscapes of operation that are necessary to fuel our urban environments. And if we take this to an end, I would even argue that this condition contains already the whole planet. We need the oceans to absorb our CO2. We need every inch of land probably to nurture humans in the future. We need the Amazon to generate CO2. To some degree, the planetary urbanization reached a point where we truly have to think about sustainability. So that's already scary, but we have to add another topic, and Kian mentioned this in her introduction, that we are at the edge of climate change. And climate change will put a completely new pressure to the discussion. So we have, I don't know if you were aware of the news, that in January 2016, we had warmer temperatures in Southern California than on the North Pole, which caused an incredible melting of the ice shields. And we probably already hit for a very long time the point of no return. So the question is, what are we going to do in this condition? And in the morning, when we were more referring to the 60s, and there's a kind of similarity between the 60s and what is happening at the moment. And the 60s were fueled through the, let's say, the power against the technocratic city, while today we are fighting a completely different situation. So I want to very quickly once more create a synopsis, a very short synopsis of the papers that had been presented. So Kian, I think, called out a very, very serious topic. We have climate change. The climate change is literally probably a tsunami that is going to hit, and we are still sitting on the beach and drink our cocktail. And the climate change will foster a lot of situations and conditions that are embedded in the way how our planet is urbanized. We have the conflict of top-down and bottom-up. We don't really know how to manage our cities. We need to generate methods and tools that sit in between. We have vulnerable demographics and participants, and those that are rich and those that are poor, and those that are informed and those that are not informed, those who had formerly been invaders in form of colonial forces and those that had been living in these areas. So there's a lot of polarization, and this will fuel the problems that we are going to face. In the second paper, Jeannette, it was very interesting to see that the first presentation was serious and called out the problems and the challenges that we are facing. Very, very important, I believe, and something, and I will call this out once more at the end, that we should not, let's say, there is an elephant in the room, or as John taught me 3 years ago in Canada, we say there's a moose under the table. That Derek was actually also talking about this, saying there is this anxiety of the post-apocalyptic, and we are trying to stay away from it. And I think while Kian really brought it to us, that there are these problems, and we need to find new methods and tools to govern and run our urban landscapes that will be under pressure and that are under pressure already. In Jeannette's and Sarah's presentation, it was very interesting to hear how everyone was laughing and very entertained through their presentation, which called, to some degree, they were both dealing with very serious topics, but it was a way of bringing these topics to us so that we can actually understand them and also understand them in the scale 1-to-1. So Jeannette talks about urban metabolism. There is a guidebook that wants to be a guidebook and is partly also trying to get through the back door and say, no, I'm showing you what is happening. And you are able, I mean, it was charged and fueled with a lot of tools of representation that helps us to understand the content, but also stays a little bit on the level of representation, what is facts, and maybe less, and I don't know if this was your intent or not, maybe less, this is what you need to do to solve the problem. It was more about, this is what is happening, and it is a very individual situation under the dome to some degree, and these conditions are very different. And that allows us to really understand what urban metabolism might be. And then in Sarah's thesis synopsis, I mean, extremely beautiful drawings that bring to us not only the species, while we are expanding with our urban, species also invading. They are not allowing us to take their territory away. They become new inhabitants of the urban. And with this, there is a completely new set of ecologies. And the way how you are looking at it and how you're representing this phenomenon, where you change perspective, and you both stay in the scale 1-to-1, which I thought was really, really helpful to avoid the problem of staying away from it. Because a 1-to-1 scale of the raccoon or of my house and how I'm living in it and what this means in relationship to the metabolism helps a lot. So I think this, if I also bring back once more Kian's introduction, where it is the 1-to-1 scale of the vulnerable population that will suffer from these top-down infrastructures, I think what all brings you together is the understanding of what we need to represent. We need not only to understand all of these circumstances and establish productive design strategies in it, but we first of all need to understand it is a 1-to-1. You cannot run away in a 1-to 10,000 and say, well, it's just a regional condition. You have to similarly think both scales simultaneously, and the 1-to-1 is probably the possibility for us to create an intimate and personal relationship so that we can become actors in this, let's say, challenging future. And I still call it challenging. I'm not afraid to say it's going to be a very problematic future, but we want to keep it maybe positive. So what is going to be in need is a massive change in an incredible large scale, because we are talking about a planetary condition. So my question to the three speakers, let's have a look if I can use the old question that I framed. So let's maybe go back to Lefebvre, and it's really about the revolutionary aspect of urbanization. The question is, are we radical and revolutionary enough? Are we maybe now in the second stage? So there were first a ramp-up in the 60s where maybe there were schools burned down, there was a huge protest against curricula, but today we are on a higher level of facing these problems. So are we revolutionary enough to establish a new meta level so that we can basically manage the challenges that we will face? And what are the tools and methods that we need? I mean, I want to move away a little bit from representation, though I think representation is a part of it. Because if we cannot communicate this to participants, if we can't build agencies as designers, if we can't establish a bottom-up movement where at the end of the day everyone can participate in it, then I think we will run into troubles. I want to add a little bit fuel to the discussion, though it's going to be heavy. I don't know if any one of you saw the documentary Racing Extinction, which is basically a huge call out for action, that the biggest problem that we are going to change with the climate change is not, and the extinction of species is not so much that we lose our superfauna, the bears and the tigers that we all like, and but that we will suffer from the fact that all of the micro ecologies will be killed, plankton in the foremost, that will cause a lot of troubles in relationship to the production of oxygen later on. So the documentary is very serious on the one hand side, but also has the way out, the possibility for everyone to actually understand we need to do something, and there is a possibility for me to be active. And it basically says, if we don't care, we, all of us here, will be the generation who let all of this happen. And when I walked out of the documentary, I was really close to the point where I said, I have to switch my profession because I really want to do something, and just teaching is not fast enough. It is literally not fast enough. So massive change is very important. And to some degree, I think massive change means we all need to be able to participate in it. And what are we able to contribute as designers to make this happen? Okay, thank you.